She was waiting to be executed, until one cowboy broke every rule and married her. The hammer of the gallows struck wood 3 times at dawn, each blow echoing across the settlement like a judge's gavel. Anna Mason sat on the plank floor of her cell, back against cold stone, watching dust motes drift through the barred window. Her hands lay still in her lap, wrists still bearing rope burns from the arrest. For a moment she simply breathed, counting each inhale before the rattle of the crowd outside grew louder. She knew this sound, made for horse thieves and outlaws, not women. Yet here she was, marked for the noose. She pressed her palm against the rough wall, but the stone offered no comfort. She bit back the urge to call out. Any plea would only feed the hunger of those gathering to watch. Her crime was written in the marshal's ledger, 1 man dead, no witnesses to speak for her defense. He'd cornered her after a stagecoach robbery went wrong. She had stayed upright while others ran, stayed to fight when he decided a woman alone was easier prey than gold. Now alone, without kin or coin, she was condemned with no appeal. Then came the scrape of boots on the jailhouse steps. Her head lifted. A man filled the doorway, tall, shoulders weathered by years under open sky, a worn law book tucked under one arm. His hat shadowed his face, his stride measured. That deliberateness unsettled her more than shouting would have. He looked like he belonged in courtrooms or cattle drives, not a frontier jail at execution hour. She thought he'd come to confirm the details, to make sure the rope was ready. It was Roger Harris, a cowboy turned landowner who'd survived by keeping his head down and his word solid. He'd been in town for supplies when he heard about the execution, heard the marshal dismiss it as quick justice for a quick crime. He'd spent the night reading through territorial statutes by lamplight, hoping for loopholes, never expecting to find one, never expecting to use it. He stopped a short distance from the cell bars, his gaze steady, measuring the weight of what came next. He'd seen frontier justice hang innocent people before, seen towns convinced that speed mattered more than truth. He knew what she thought, that he was here to witness, that he was no different. Slowly, he opened the law book, turned it so the marshal could see the page marked with his thumb. His voice came low, deliberate. Territorial Statute 47. A condemned woman can be released into the custody of a man of standing if he agrees to marry her and take legal responsibility for her conduct. Anna's eyes widened, her body went rigid, fingers curling against the stone floor. She wanted to speak, to demand what trick this was, but shock sealed her throat. She watched every gesture, waiting for the condition that would make this worse than hanging. Roger met the marshal's skeptical stare, then looked past him to Anna. He kept his hat low, giving her space to think, not forcing her eyes to meet his. His next words were for her alone. The law's clear. If you accept, you walk out of here. If you don't, I leave, and he didn't finish. He didn't need to. The marshal sputtered, flipping through pages to verify, but the statute was there, dusty, archaic, designed for a different era when women were property to be claimed or discarded. Roger had found the one thread of law that valued a woman's life over a town's bloodlust. You understand what you're asking, the marshal said, voice tight with disbelief. You'll be bound to her. Her crimes become yours if she runs or causes trouble. I understand, Roger replied, his tone unchanged. Anna studied him through the bars, the sun-scarred hands holding that book, the set of his jaw that suggested a man who'd made harder choices and lived with them. No mercy in his eyes, but no cruelty either. Just a tired resolve that looked like her own when she'd decided to survive that night instead of surrender. The marshal looked between them, then at the crowd visible through the window, already impatient for their spectacle. He swore under his breath, pulled the cell key from his belt. "You'll need a witness and a preacher," he said, unlocking the door with reluctant clicks of iron. "And if this is some scheme?" "It's not," Roger said simply. Anna rose on unsteady legs, every instinct screaming that men who offer rescue expect payment she couldn't afford to give. But the rope waited outside, and this stranger offered a different gamble. As the marshal opened the cell door fully, Roger extended his hand, not to grab her, but palm up, an invitation she could refuse. She looked at that offered hand, at the calluses that spoke of honest work, at the scars that suggested he knew what it meant to bleed. Then she looked past him to the window where the gallows stood sharp against the morning sky. Anna placed her hand in his. The crowd's murmur turned to confusion as Roger led her not toward the platform, but toward the preacher's quarters. She walked beside him, chin lifted despite the chains still on her wrists, watching the faces that had come to see her die now twist with outrage and disbelief. Someone shouted that justice was being cheated. Roger's grip on her hand tightened just slightly, not restraint, but reassurance. Whatever came next, she was no longer walking toward death alone. "If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 50 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter." The marshal's office smelled of old tobacco and lamp oil, the air thick with disbelief. Roger stood before the desk, the law book open to the statute, while Marshal Pritchard read the passage for the third time as though the words might rearrange themselves into something more convenient. "This is madness, Harris," Pritchard muttered, dragging a hand down his face. "You don't even know this woman. She killed a man." "In self-defense," Roger said evenly. "That's not what the jury decided. There was no jury. Just you and the town council, and the hanging scheduled before sundown the same day." Pritchard's jaw tightened, but he couldn't argue the point. Through the window, the crowd had begun to gather thicker, voices rising with impatience. Someone called out asking when the show would start. Roger's stomach turned at the casual cruelty of it. "I'll need witnesses," Pritchard said finally, his tone resigned. "And Reverend Michaels. If he'll even agree to this." "He will," Roger replied. "The law doesn't ask if he approves, only that he performs the ceremony." Anna stood in a doorway flanked by a deputy, wrists bound in iron cuffs that had rubbed her skin raw. Her dress was torn at the hem, dirt-streaked from days in the cell. She looked like something already half dead, her eyes sunken but alert, tracking every movement in the room with the wariness of a trapped animal. When Pritchard explained Roger's proposal, her expression didn't change immediately. She stared at Roger as though trying to decode a language she'd never heard. This man, this stranger with sun-scarred skin and eyes like weathered stone, wanted to bind his life to hers. Not out of love or lust, but something she couldn't name. Duty? Pity? Some private guilt she'd never understand. Why? Her voice came rough from disuse. Roger met her gaze directly. Because the law gives you a choice. And you deserve one. It wasn't an answer, not really, but it was more honesty than she'd received since her arrest. The marshal produced papers from a drawer, spreading them across the desk with obvious distaste. Marriage certificate, custody transfer, a sworn statement that Roger Harris accepted full legal responsibility for Anna Mason's conduct henceforth. "Sign here," Pritchard said, pointing to a line. "And here." Anna's hands trembled as the deputy unlocked one cuff so she could hold the pen. The letters swam before her eyes. She could make out her name, Rogers, the official seal at the top. Her hand hovered over the paper. This was a different kind of trap, one with softer edges but no less binding. She'd be traded from the law's possession to this man's. Yet when she looked up, Roger was watching her with something almost like patience, as though he'd accept whatever choice she made. Outside, someone started singing a hanging ballad. The sound drifted through the window, mocking and cruel. Anna pressed the pen to paper and signed. Her hand shook not from fear of the noose now, but from the terror of waking tomorrow when she'd prepared to die today. Reverend Michaels arrived with a Bible clutched tight against his chest and reluctance written across his face. He took his position on the jailhouse steps, mouth pressed into a thin line of disapproval. The crowd had swelled to twice its earlier size, drawn by rumors that spread faster than wildfire. They pressed close, a wall of hostile faces hungry for spectacle, if not a hanging, then at least a scandal worth repeating. Anna stood beside Roger in the harsh noon sun, still wearing the dirt-streaked dress, her wrists finally free of cuffs but bearing their marks. The deputy had offered to fetch something better for her to wear, but there was no time. The marshal wanted this done quickly, before someone decided to challenge the legality with a rope. Michaels opened the Bible but barely looked at it. He'd performed this ceremony dozens of times for couples glowing with joy or trembling with nervous excitement. This was neither. His voice came flat, stripped of warmth. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here." Anna barely heard the words. Her attention fixed on the crowd, the women clutching their children closer as though she might contaminate them, the men with arms crossed and eyes full of judgment. She recognized the butcher, the seamstress, the banker who'd refused her mother's loan request years ago. All of them certain of her guilt, certain this marriage was a mockery. "Do you, Roger Harris, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Roger's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd, steady and deliberate. "I do." Michaels turned to Anna, and for a moment their eyes met. She saw his doubt, his conviction that she was unworthy of this grace. Her throat tightened. "Do you, Anna Mason, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Her voice cracked when she spoke, barely more than a whisper. "I do." Roger reached into his vest pocket and produced a simple iron band, not silver or gold, just blacksmith's work, practical and unadorned. He took her left hand gently, his calloused fingers careful as he slid the ring onto her finger. It was slightly too large, meant for work not adornment, like the man himself. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you man and wife." No one applauded. Someone in the crowd cursed. Another voice rose in protest, shouting about justice denied, about murderers walking free. The marshal stepped forward, hand on his pistol, and the crowd reluctantly parted. Roger's horse waited at the hitching post, a sturdy roan with patient eyes. He mounted first, then offered his hand to Anna. She hesitated only a second before accepting, pulling herself up to sit behind him. The moment she settled, someone in the crowd spat. The saliva landed in the dust near the horse's hooves, close enough to make the intent clear. Roger didn't turn, didn't acknowledge it. He simply touched his heels to the horse's flanks and guided them toward the edge of town. Anna wrapped her arms around his waist to keep from falling, feeling the solid warmth of him through his shirt. As they rode past the gallows, its shadow fell across them briefly before giving way to open country. She wondered, watching the settlement shrink behind them, if she'd simply traded one form of death for another, slower perhaps, but just as certain. The first week passed in careful choreography, two strangers learning to orbit each other without collision. Anna woke before dawn to find coffee already hot on the stove, Roger's doing before he disappeared to mend fence lines or work with the horses. She'd pour herself a cup and stand at the window, watching his silhouette move against the brightening sky, trying to understand the shape of this new captivity. She started with the garden because it demanded the least interaction. The weeds had choked most of what had been planted, but she salvaged what she could, beans climbing their poles, a few stubborn tomato plants, herbs gone half wild. Her hands remembered this work from childhood, before everything had gone wrong. She worked until her back ached and her palms blistered, grateful for pain she could understand. Roger returned at midday for a silent meal. She'd learned to time the cooking so food was ready when he came through the door. He ate methodically, never commenting on the quality, never complaining when she burned the cornbread or under-seasoned the beans. Afterwards, he'd nod once and return to whatever task consumed his afternoon. The chickens came next. She repaired the coop door with scraps of leather and bent nails, then spent an hour coaxing the half-feral birds back to roosting inside. When she collected the first eggs, she felt an absurd surge of accomplishment that embarrassed her. These were basic tasks any farm wife managed without thought, yet she'd been so far removed from normal life that gathering eggs felt like victory. She watched Roger when he thought she wasn't looking. The way he always ensured she ate first before taking his own portion. How he left kindling split and stacked beside the stove each night. The books, she'd noticed them finally, stacked beside his bedroll in the barn. Practical volumes mostly, animal husbandry and soil management, but also poetry, which surprised her. She hadn't expected a man who spoke so little to seek out other people's words. One evening she found wildflowers in a jar on the kitchen table. Not arranged artfully, just stems thrust into water, but clearly gathered and placed there deliberately. She stared at them for a long moment, throat tight. She didn't know what they meant. A peace offering? A claim of ownership disguised as kindness? Or simply an act without agenda, which terrified her most of all? That night, after Roger had retired to the barn, she stood in the doorway of the bedroom he'd surrendered to her. The room was sparse, a bed with a worn quilt, a trunk, a single window facing east. His room, given over without hesitation or resentment. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the iron band on her finger, still too large, still foreign. She didn't understand this kind of mercy. Cruelty had taught her to be strong, to expect nothing, to survive by keeping everyone at arm's length. But this quiet generosity left her defenseless, stripped of the armor she'd built from betrayal and loss. As she lay down that night, she realized with creeping dread that the most dangerous thing Roger Harris could do was continue being kind without asking for anything in return. Because eventually, she might start to believe she deserved it. The rhythm became easier after the second week, though no less strange. Anna found herself anticipating Roger's movements, the sound of his boots on the porch at noon, the creak of the barn door at dusk when he finished his work. She stopped flinching when he entered a room, though wariness remained a constant companion, quieter now but never fully silent. She proved more capable than either of them had expected. The mending pile shrank as she worked through torn shirts and split seams with neat, efficient stitches. She learned the temperament of the old cook stove, how to coax heat from green wood and when to bank the coals for morning. The garden began to look less like a battleground and more like something intentional, Rose straightening under her care. Roger spent his days working the fence line that bordered the property, replacing rotted posts and restringing wire pulled loose by winter storms. She watched him from the garden sometimes, the way he moved with purpose but without haste, checking his work twice before moving on. He had 3 horses in addition to the roan, a paint mare with a gentle disposition, and 2 younger geldings he was breaking for sale to a ranch outfit come autumn. She saw him work with the flighty bay one morning, his voice low and steady as the horse shied and snorted. No force, no anger when the animal refused the saddle. Just patience, endless and uncommon. He spent an hour simply standing in the corral, letting the bay approach and retreat on its own terms, until finally it nosed his shoulder with cautious trust. That's when she understood. He was breaking horses the way he was handling her, with space and time and the radical notion that some things couldn't be forced. Their meals remained mostly silent, but the quality of that silence shifted. Less like 2 prisoners avoiding eye contact, more like 2 people comfortable with quiet. She noticed he always served her first, even when she protested it wasn't necessary. He'd simply set the plate before her and take his seat, making it clear this wasn't negotiable. One evening she found him reading on the porch in the last light, one of the poetry volumes balanced on his knee. She paused in the doorway, curious despite herself. "Whitman," he said without looking up, as though she'd asked. "Found it in a trading post years back." Never made much sense of it, but the words sound right out loud. It was the most he'd said to her all week that wasn't practical instruction. She lingered, unsure how to respond to this small opening. "Read some," she said finally. He looked up then, surprise flickering across his features before he nodded. His voice was rough but careful as he read about the open road and songs of himself. Anna leaned against the doorframe and closed her eyes, letting the words wash over her. They didn't make much sense to her either, but there was something in the rhythm, the cadence of them, that felt like possibility. When he finished, the sun had dropped below the hills. Roger closed the book gently. "You get that from Catherine?" Anna asked, the question surprising them both. Roger went still. "My sister." "Yes." She loved words. The way he said it, past tense, loved, told Anna everything. They sat in the gathering darkness, 2 people bound by law but connected now by something more fragile, the recognition that they'd both lost things that couldn't be recovered, and survived anyway. The rain came sudden and hard, turning the evening sky black and driving Roger from the barn to the cabin's covered porch. He stood there dripping, hesitating at the threshold as though the space inside still belonged exclusively to Anna. She looked up from the stove where she'd been preparing supper and made a decision that surprised her. "You'll catch your death out there," she said. "Come in." He entered carefully, removing his hat and hanging it on the peg by the door. Water pooled at his feet. Anna handed him a towel without comment and returned to stirring the pot of beans. The rain drummed on the roof, filling the silence between them with something other than awkwardness. They ate at the small table, the storm raging outside. Lightning flickered through the window, illuminating the cabin in stark flashes. Roger finished his meal and sat back, staring at his empty plate as though deciding something. "I had a sister," he said finally. "Catherine. 3 years younger than me." Anna went still, her spoon halfway to her mouth. Roger never volunteered information about himself. She set the spoon down carefully and waited. "We were trailing cattle up from Texas when she got sick. Fever. We stopped in a town, decent-sized place with a doctor. But Catherine was half Apache. Our mother's people." His jaw tightened. "The doctor refused to see her. Said he didn't treat Indians. The hotel wouldn't give us a room. By the time we found someone willing to help, 3 towns later," he stopped, the rest unnecessary. The rain intensified, hammering the roof. Anna understood now why he'd stood before the marshal with that law book, why he'd offered his name to a woman no one else would defend. "I'm sorry," she said, the words inadequate but genuine. Roger shook his head. "I should have fought harder. Should have made them see her. Instead, I followed their rules, and she died because of it. That's not your fault. Isn't it?" He looked at her then, his eyes carrying a weight she recognized. "I let them decide she wasn't worth saving." Anna felt something crack open in her chest. She'd carried her own guilt for so long, the weight of survival when others judged her for refusing to die quietly. "The man I killed," she began, her voice steadier than she expected. "They said I murdered him for his money. That's not what happened." She met Roger's gaze directly. "He cornered me after the robbery went wrong. He had a knife. He told me exactly what he was going to do before he killed me. So I fought. I got his knife away and I used it." The cabin was silent except for the rain. "I'd do it again," Anna said. "Every time. I'd choose to live." Roger nodded slowly, and when he spoke, his voice held something she'd never heard from anyone, validation without qualification. "Good." That single word settled into her bones like warmth after a long cold. Not, "I understand," or "I forgive you," but simply good, as though her choice to survive was not just acceptable but right. As though she'd done exactly what she should have. Anna blinked against the sudden burning in her eyes. No one had ever affirmed her right to fight back, to refuse the role of victim that everyone else had assigned her. "Thank you," she whispered. Roger stood and began clearing the dishes, giving her space for her emotion. "We've both lost people to others' rules about who deserves mercy," he said. "Seems like we ought to make our own rules out here." Through the window, the rain continued to fall, washing the world clean. They came on a Thursday morning when the sun was high and merciless. Anna saw them first, 2 riders approaching from the east, their horses moving at a pace that suggested purpose rather than passing through. She set down the basket of eggs and walked quickly to the cabin, her pulse already quickening with old fear. "Roger," she called toward the barn. "Riders coming." He emerged immediately, wiping his hands on his trousers, his eyes narrowing as he tracked the approaching figures. Without a word, he went into the barn and returned with his rifle, checking the chamber with practiced efficiency before positioning himself on the porch. Not raised, not threatening, but present. "Stay inside," he said quietly. "But where you can hear." The riders pulled up 20 feet from the porch, their horses blowing hard. The men wore dust like second skin, their faces shadowed by wide-brimmed hats. The one on the left had a star pinned to his vest, deputy or marshal from some other territory. The other wore no badge but had the look of someone comfortable with violence. "Roger Harris," the badged one called out. "That's right. We're here for the woman. Anna Mason. Heard you married her to cheat the gallows in redemption." Anna pressed herself against the wall beside the window, watching through the gap in the curtains. Her breath came shallow and quick. Roger's voice remained level, almost conversational. "My wife's name is Anna Harris now. And our marriage is legal under territorial statute." The second rider spat into the dirt. "Legal don't make it right. Woman killed a man. There's reward money for bringing her back." "She was tried and sentenced," Roger said. "Then legally released into my custody through marriage. What you're suggesting is kidnapping a man's wife." "We're suggesting justice," the badged man countered, his hand drifting toward his sidearm. "Way we see it, you pulled some legal trick to steal what belongs to the law." Roger shifted his weight slightly, the rifle still angled down but ready. "The law released her. If you have a problem with that, take it up with Marshal Pritchard in redemption. But you're not taking her from my property. You willing to die for a murderer?" "I'm willing to defend my wife." Roger's voice hardened. "She's my responsibility now, which means she's under my protection. You cross this threshold, you're trespassing against a married woman's home, and I will respond accordingly." The two riders exchanged glances. Anna could see the calculation happening. Was the reward money worth a gunfight with a man who clearly knew how to handle a rifle? The unmarked rider's hand had moved to his weapon, but he hadn't drawn. "This ain't over," the badged man said finally. "There's folks in 3 counties who think justice got cheated. Then those folks can file a legal complaint," Roger replied. "Until then, you're on private property without invitation." The tension stretched thin as wire. Anna's hand found the iron band on her finger, gripping it like an anchor. This man, this near stranger, was putting his life between her and violence, not because he loved her or even knew her well, but because he'd made a promise and meant to keep it. The riders turned their horses slowly, deliberately, making their displeasure clear. But they turned. As they rode away, the unmarked one called back over his shoulder. "You're making enemies, Harris. Hope she's worth it." Roger stood on the porch until they disappeared over the rise. Only then did he lower the rifle, his shoulders dropping slightly as tension bled out. Anna stepped onto the porch, her legs unsteady. "You could have been killed," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Roger looked at her, his expression unreadable. "So could you. That seemed worse." The morning after the riders came, Anna woke to find Roger already gone but a fresh pot of coffee waiting and the fire built up against the early chill. She poured herself a cup and stood at the window, watching him work with the paint mare in the corral. He moved with his usual patient deliberateness, but she saw something different now, the way he'd positioned himself between her and danger without hesitation, the absolute certainty in his voice when he'd called her his wife. She finished her coffee and went to the garden, but her mind kept circling back to that moment on the porch. He could have been killed. For her. For a legal arrangement born of desperation. Yet he'd stood his ground as though protecting her was the most natural thing in the world. That afternoon, she walked beyond the fence line and gathered wildflowers, black-eyed Susans and purple aster growing wild in the meadow. She arranged them carefully in the jar on the table, taking time to make them look intentional rather than haphazard. When Roger came in for supper, he paused at the sight, his eyes moving from the flowers to her face. "They're nice," he said quietly. "Brighten the place." She nodded, suddenly self-conscious, and turned back to the stove. 2 days later, she found one of his shirts torn at the shoulder seam, probably caught on barbed wire. Instead of a simple functional repair, she took her time, using small, careful stitches that would hold strong but remain nearly invisible. She left it folded on the porch rail where he'd find it. Roger started talking more at meals. Not about anything profound, just observations about the horses, plans for winterizing the barn, thoughts about bringing in more chickens before the cold set in. But Anna noticed the shift in his language, the way I gradually became we. "We should reinforce the henhouse before snow," he said one evening. "And we might want to lay in more firewood than usual. Winter could be hard." We. As though this wasn't temporary. As though she'd be here when winter came. She found herself watching for him during the day, her hands stilling in their work when she caught sight of him moving across the property. Once, she brought him water while he was mending fence, and their fingers brushed as he took the ladle. Neither pulled away immediately. The contact lasted a heartbeat longer than necessary, and when their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them. Roger began staying later on the porch in the evenings, reading his books while Anna worked on mending or preparation for the next day's meals. Sometimes she'd sit in the doorway, neither inside nor out, occupying the threshold. They'd talk in fragments, about weather, about the garden's progress, about small things that somehow felt significant. One night, as she rose to go inside, Roger spoke without looking up from his book. "I'm glad you stayed." Anna paused, her hand on the doorframe. "So am I." It was the truth, and it terrified her. Somewhere between the confrontation with the Riders and this moment, the marriage had stopped being a legal fiction and started becoming something neither of them had names for yet. She wasn't his prisoner or his obligation anymore. She was something else, something that felt dangerously close to a partner. Inside, she touched the iron band on her finger and found it didn't feel quite so foreign anymore. They came at dusk when shadows stretched long and hungry across the land. Anna heard them before she saw them, the sound of many horses, voices raised in righteous anger. She stepped to the window and her blood went cold. At least a dozen riders, several carrying torches that cut orange wounds in the dimming light. Roger was already moving, pulling his rifle from above the door and checking his revolver. His face was grim but composed, as though he'd been expecting this. "How many?" he asked. 12. Maybe more. Her voice remained steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "One of them looks like," she stopped, recognizing the man at the front of the group, older, with the same heavy jaw as the man she'd killed. "His brother." Roger nodded once, unsurprised. "Stay inside until I call you. No matter what they say." He walked onto the porch as the riders formed a semicircle around the cabin, their torches casting dancing shadows. The brother, she remembered his name now, Thomas Garrett, sat his horse at the center, his face carved from stone and fury. "Roger Harris," Garrett called out. "You're harboring a murderer. We've come to take her back for proper justice." "The law released her into my custody," Roger replied, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "This is my property, and she's my wife. You have no authority here. We have the authority of decent people who won't stand for killers walking free." Garrett gestured to the men flanking him. "You've got one chance, Harris. Send her out, or we burn you both out." Roger's grip tightened on the rifle. "I'm offering you a different choice. Take your grievance to the territorial capital. Request a proper trial with a jury, real law. If they find against her, I'll accept that judgment." "We don't need their law," another man shouted. "We know what she did." "Then prove it in a court," Roger countered. "Or leave my property and don't come back. You die for her." Garrett's voice dripped contempt. "For a woman who murdered my brother in cold blood?" Inside the cabin, Anna listened to Roger defend her life again, offering his own in exchange. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had killed to survive, that had pulled weeds and mended shirts and learned to build something instead of just endure. These were her hands. This was her life. And she was done letting other people decide whether she deserved it. She opened the door and stepped onto the porch beside Roger. "Anna, get back inside," Roger said sharply. She ignored him, facing the mounted men with her chin raised. "You want me? Then face me. But you'll have to go through him first, and I won't let that happen without a fight." Roger glanced at her, something like pride flickering in his eyes before he turned back to the mob. They stood together, 2 against 12, the torches casting their shadows long behind them. Garrett raised his torch higher. "Last chance, Harris. And here's yours," a new voice cut through the tension. A rider emerged from the darkness beyond the torchlight, a man wearing a territorial marshal's badge that caught the firelight. He was older, weathered, with the kind of authority that came from years of enforcement rather than election. "Marshal Crane," Roger said, relief barely contained in his voice. "Got your letter 3 weeks ago, Harris. Took me a while to get here." Crane surveyed the scene with hard eyes. "Seems I arrived just in time to prevent a lynching." "This is local business," Garrett protested. "This is federal jurisdiction the moment you crossed county lines with intent to harm," Crane replied coldly. "The marriage is legal. I've reviewed the documents. Any man here who proceeds with violence will hang for it." He let that sink in before continuing. "You want justice? File a complaint through proper channels. But if you light those torches, you become the criminals." The mob shifted uneasily. Without the cover of righteousness, they were just men contemplating murder. One by one, the torches lowered. Garrett stared at Anna with pure hatred. "This isn't over." "Yes," Crane said flatly, "it is." The riders dispersed slowly, reluctantly, their certainty eroded by the presence of real law. When the last had disappeared into darkness, Roger finally lowered his rifle. Anna's legs suddenly felt weak, but she remained standing. Crane dismounted and approached the porch. "You've made enemies, Harris." "I know." The marshal looked at Anna. "You're a lucky woman, Mrs. Harris." Anna met his gaze steadily. "No. I'm a woman who refused to die quietly. There's a difference." Crane's weathered face creased with something approximating a smile. "I suppose there is." The first snow came in late October, dusting the mountains white and sending a warning that winter would arrive soon and without mercy. Anna and Roger worked long days preparing, splitting wood until the pile reached the barn's eaves, reinforcing the chicken coop against wind, storing root vegetables in a cold cellar beneath the cabin. The threats had subsided after Marshal Crane's intervention, but they both knew hostile eyes still watched from town, waiting for any excuse to finish what they'd started. One evening after a particularly hard day's work, they sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, watching the sun set behind the peaks. The air had turned cold enough that their breath misted, and Anna could feel winter pressing close. Roger had been quiet all day, more withdrawn than usual, and she'd learned to recognize the weight of unspoken things in his silence. "Why did you really do it?" she asked finally, her voice cutting through the twilight. "I know what you told me about Catherine. But there's more, isn't there?" Roger was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. He stared out at the land they'd been working, the fence line they'd rebuilt together, the garden they'd harvested and put to bed for winter. "I was tired," he said finally. "Tired of watching injustice happen and doing nothing. Tired of being the kind of man who turns away because it's easier." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Everyone deserves a chance someone else didn't give them. Catherine didn't get that chance." "Maybe," he trailed off, struggling. Anna watched his profile, saw the struggle between what he wanted to say and what he could. She understood that fight, had lived it herself every day since the hanging had been commuted. "Because sometimes two broken people make something whole," she finished softly. Roger turned to look at her then, and in his eyes she saw something that looked like hope, fragile and new as spring ice. "Yes," he said simply. Anna stood and crossed the small space between them, her blanket falling away. She placed her hand over his, their fingers intertwining with an ease that would have seemed impossible 3 months ago. His hand was rough with calluses, scarred from work and weather, and it fit perfectly against hers. "I was so angry when you saved me," she said. "Angry that I had to owe someone my life. Angry that I couldn't choose to die on my own terms." She squeezed his hand. "But you gave me something better than death. You gave me the choice to live." "You gave yourself that," Roger replied. "I just opened the door." They stood together looking out at the land spreading before them, the cabin they'd made into a home, the barn where Roger still insisted on sleeping despite Anna's hints that he didn't have to, the fence line marking boundaries they'd defend together. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't safe. But it was theirs, built from nothing by two people who'd learned that survival wasn't the same as living. "Winter's coming," Anna said. "It is. We should probably winterize the barn better. Make sure there's enough room for both of us to sleep warm if needed." Roger looked at her, understanding the careful offering in those words. "We probably should." The next morning, they rose before dawn and worked side by side as the sun painted the frost-covered fields gold. Roger split wood while Anna stacked it. She carried water while he fed the horses. When their hands brushed passing tools, neither pulled away. They were partners now in truth, not just on paper, two broken people who discovered that sometimes the strongest foundations are built from fragments of shattered lives. As the sun climbed higher and their breath no longer misted in the warming air, Anna looked at the man beside her and felt something she'd thought died the day they'd built her gallows. She felt hope. And for the first time since the iron band had been placed on her finger, when she looked at it, she didn't see a chain. She saw a choice she'd made, and would make again, to build a life worth defending. Together, they turned toward the cabin as smoke began to rise from the chimney, ready to face whatever winter, or the world, would bring.